So people who are heading towards the back, this venue is much bigger than we normally have. So it's going to feel a little bit empty. Feel free to come as far forward, and you probably won't have people next to you anyway if you would like to go up. I don't think so.
Start beatboxing. Everyone knows.
Okay. Phones silent, please. There's always one. Okay. Welcome, and thanks for coming out tonight for our talk on Agile requirements, which is really easy, so it should only take about 5 minutes.
Don't do it.
Thanks to our sponsor, DBT. And I'll keep this very short. And our speaker, Cara, Scrum Master, Agile Coach, Surfer, Welder.
That's it. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be doing the first one in the new venue, and I'm glad you all found it. So well done on you. Apparently getting out of the parking lot is a lot harder, so be aware as you leave, and possibly don't drink too much. So this talk is a story. It's got very little theory. It's what we've done on a project that is Agile Requirements, using good practice that has been kind of going around for a while. The idea is to give a picture of what we did. It's hard to move from doing upfront analysis to not doing upfront analysis, and this is a story of what we've done. So there will be little bits of theory, but it's mostly just the pictures. So, before we talk about me, let's talk about you. Who's working on Agile projects? Show of hands. Okay, lots of you. Who's doing waterfall or something else? So my question to you guys is, when do you document requirements? Once you built it. What else?
When applicable.
When applicable.
As soon as I have the idea, I write it on a post-it.
Okay. How many of you are doing quite heavy upfront analysis? Okay. Why do we do that?
When we're building a military system that's going to kill people.
Okay. Out of fear. Of what?
Of the unknown.
Oh, yeah. That's true. So usually you do it to answer 3 questions. What's in and out of scope? How long will it take to build this? And what's it going to cost? Right? That's the thinking. What's going to cost? Well, I don't know. What's inside? Well, how long will it take? And the answer to that is always, well, it depends, right? So about me and Agile requirements. I started off, aside from my other personalities which have recently been mentioned, I started off in project administration. And so my life look at projects was in the project office through a computer. I wasn't involved in the projects themselves. And the company I was with was doing RUP. So we had lots of documents. And we had lots of FRSs and we had lots of BRSs. And my picture from the outside was that projects are typically late and projects are typically expensive. And looking at this, these are the problems that we needed to solve, right? And what I started thinking is, if we had better coordination, wouldn't that make it better? Because, you know, things just keep getting longer. If we could coordinate it, it would get better, right? But while you're doing it, it's very hard to imagine doing things differently. So we just try and do this thing that isn't working better, and ultimately it'll work, right? So then I became a project manager, and the environment I was working in was a sort of waterfall, sort of scrum, but, and the documents were in use. We had BRS, FRS, and now we started also having test specs. So BA would write the BRS, and then the BA would write the FRS, and they would rush to get it done before the devs were ready to build, and then they'd start writing the test spec so that they could test this thing. The problem we encountered most was change requests. We were working much more closely with the client, but every time things changed, it didn't fit. There was one point we talked about version controlling a use case, not the document, but in the use case, so that we could keep that up to date. So the big question that was prominent in my mind was, what do we do when information changes? How do we handle it? If we could do that better, would our projects become less late and less expensive, right? Still, it's hard to imagine doing things differently because we're trying to do this thing right? And then I became a Scrum Master dedicated on Agile teams who were doing Scrum and Kanban, and we had product backlogs and release burn downs that didn't really look like that. And to be honest, I've never actually seen one that looks where people track that regularly. So I haven't seen it, but she's done it.
When the team's lying, it often looks like that.
Right.
And when they're burned down by hours, it always looks like that.
Okay. So when it actually works that way, yeah. Anyway, but the question that then started coming up is, but where's the spec? Because we're working with this user story, and we used to have the BRS, and we used to have the FRS, and all that detail. Where's that gone? And the other problem that came from that is, how do we find out what users really want? Because part of the whole team is now involved in writing a spec. They don't have a BA. We didn't have an analyst on the team that I was working on here. I'm only working now for the first time with a team that has an analyst on it, but we had to get documentation out. So how do we get that information, and how do we build this thing in an agile way? By now I'm beginning to work out that we can do things differently. So it's a little bit less hard, but how to do that was the question that was still plaguing me. So, who knows what that is? Yeah. Design, analyze, design, develop, deploy, test, deploy, to lots and lots of different machines all at once, and duck, right? So this is what we do in Agile. Do you guys recognize that? It's my schematic for the Scrum cycle. We've got a backlog, we do some work, we produce working software, we work off our backlog, we do some work. The feedback loop is obviously much nicer than it's shorter here. And that is an advantage that Agile had given us, so it was definitely moving in the right direction. So, the fact factors that are involved in Agile requirements, and since most of you doing this, you probably are familiar with it, the whole team participates. It's no longer the thing that belongs to the business analyst who sits over there and writes it all out and shoves it down. The whole team participates, and the product owner owns it. We start with an overview of the whole application. So we start with a big picture, but it's an overview, it's not the detail. Then we work at a sprint and a half ahead to get the sprint ready detail. The idea behind it being the right detail at the right time. Sounds cool, huh? But what does that really mean?
It's never going to happen.
Pardon?
It's never going to happen.
You don't think? Okay. I hope that you have a different picture by the time you leave. So the concepts I'm working with come from deliberate discovery, a gentleman by the name of Dan North and a bunch of people working with him. And the idea behind that is that we are only ever decreasing uncertainty over time. That fear of the unknown never goes away. But hopefully we lose the fear of it and we can embrace it. So we can get more and more and more knowledge, but we will never lose that uncertainty. And along with that is real options, which is a mathematical sort of, I think it starts in financial, but there are two guys, Chris Matz and Olaf Marson, who have been looking at those parts of it as a way of looking at making binding decisions at the right time. So you start with an idea of what it is you want to build, but you might not decide where a button is going to go on a page before you've even put in a basic architecture. Now that's difficult when you're thinking of upfront requirements and you've got to get everything just so, and you document the flow all the way through, and when the thing does that, so you should do that. You don't know that yet. So at what point do you make that binding decision? Jeff Patton used this image in his talk at Agile India, and it led me to a whole lot of interesting new research. But basically the concept is that we unfold what we know over time. So we'll start at the very beginning with a very little bit of knowledge. And then we'll grow some more knowledge along this axis, and time will pass and we'll have a little bit more knowledge about that axis. And as we go, this is very shaky hand, sorry for that. But as we go around and we come back to revisit where we've been before with more knowledge and more detail. It's a different, he's got specific, or the thinking behind this is specific things for each quadrant. But I think conceptually it works. So the elements of Agile requirements. Story mapping. Who's doing story mapping? Some of you. Okay. Product backlog. You all working with backlogs? Story cards, mock-ups, and scenarios. Okay. Whoops. We do this thing called doing the work. Yeah. And then grooming and release planning. You'll notice that that's right at the end. Well, it's not at the end, but it's at the end of this order. So those artifacts, this is more or less what they look like. Story map. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there, but not a huge amount. Basically, at the top level, we've got a concept, kind of a capability that a client needs, some features, or ethics, and some features, and depending on the size of your story, you get more and more fine grained. But it's a big upfront picture of what this thing conceptually is. Then we updated our backlog. Now, unfortunately, our backlog was in Google Docs, so it did look a little bit like that. And this is a story about a real project. So we updated our backlog with all of the little pieces in there, got created as stories. And then we turned those into story cards. And as we worked with that, we updated our backlog. And then we did this thing from project management. So risk, assumption, dependencies, and unknowns. We worked through each of those for all of the feature sets. With that information, we updated our backlog. And then we went into detailed grooming, the sprint ready detail with our story cards and our notes and mock-ups. Whoa. From which we would update our backlog again. And once we had a concept of each story, we would get into the detailed scenarios, either in grooming or in SP1. And the scenarios would help us update the backlog as well, and then we turn that into specific cards with specific tasks. Yep. And update the backlog. So, onto our story. The problem that we were trying to solve, our client comes to us and says, we have collections lists. Our application for administrating them is out of date. The reason for this, we have edge case bloat. Over the last 10 years, consumer behavior has changed. So people are doing different things. The way we set up the information previously no longer fits. Much of it is manual. So there was a lot of paperwork. It is a waste of time. Time is your most precious resource in an organization. And the other problem they had is that they couldn't optimize the focus of where people wanted to work. So it was just kind of guesswork. We shuffled some papers around. And of course the technology is out of date because it was built 10 or more years ago. So we need to, making changes to the old technology, we actually have to replace it. So the edge case bloat over 10 years, we needed to change what appears in the lists. The manual, we needed to automate assigning of lists, and we need to make it easier to work accounts. In this story, we're going to focus mostly on that. The other two will come in, but mostly we're going to look at what happens to the client says, I need to automate lists. Right? The team, we had a product owner who was a BA previously. She had a huge amount of domain knowledge. She sat at the client, she had done an as-is documentation on the system, and she had a little bit of knowledge about Agile, but she hadn't actually worked on an Agile team, and she'd never been a product owner before. The team, we had an experienced architect, 2 mid-level developers, and 2 absolutely brand new out of university, or they'd had a little bit of working experience, but very little. They were brand new devs. None of them had any domain knowledge per se. None of them had worked with a client. These 3 guys had worked on similar environments with collections and datas, and they worked with Agile dev techniques, but they hadn't really worked with Agile requirements before. It was new to them to have a dedicated PO. And then there was myself as the as the Scrum Master. I had absolutely no domain knowledge. I didn't know the client. I hadn't worked in collections, hadn't worked in data. This was all brand new to me. But I have a fair amount of Agile knowledge. That's probably a misrepresentation, which should be a little bit more empty, but whatever. So of this, we have no systems knowledge on the team, but we have access to a systems analyst, not her role, but a person who fulfilled that function for us if we needed her. And we had the as-is systems rules document, so our product owner was familiar with that. From an Agile requirements perspective, we had many new techniques to start implementing. And the question for me as the Scrum Master is, where do we start? So I started with the whiteboard. Great place, huh? And I sat with the product owner and I said, this is how we're going to go about it, because the question to me is, when does she start writing an FRS? And I'm like, how about we don't do that? So explaining how to write the stories, the order in which we're going to have a look at this. We're going to do customer needs, personas, story, markups, MVP, release estimating, and a kind of idea for her of how we're going to go about this. So I managed to sell her on story mapping, and we had a session with the whole client, the whole stakeholder team from the client. So it was the product sponsor, the IT sponsor, the key users of the system. We had 3 users in the room, and then our whole dev team. And what we do is we start with, these are the 2 personas. We say, who are the people who are going to use the system most? And so we clarify who they are up front. It's the easiest, most commonly missed step, because why do you need to know that? Who cares? Okay? And then we say, well, when Connections Candy starts in the system, what does she need to do? This, and this. And when she's done this, well, she does this, and then she does that, and then she does this thing, and then she does that thing. So it's a kind of sequential mapping. It's sequential because it's a narrative. We're telling a story, and stories unfold over time, basically. So all of the people involved were invited to write down stickies. I would say about half participated. What are the things we need to do? So these are our persona. We have Super Sue, who's the supervisor, and her responsibilities are these, and basically she needed to plan the work. And Collections Candy, and these are her responsibilities, and you can see we had a conversation about what the words were and what, how are we thinking about it right? And that was our story map. So don't worry about the detail, this is what it looks like, right? We had our top level, our feature level or capability level information, features and stories inside of those. And these were generated with just participation. And those are our two key stories on the map, assigning lists and actioning the accounts. One of the important things that came out of it is the acceptance criteria. We had the product sponsor in the room, and he would often stop and say, but the thing you need to understand is we've got this problem. We need to solve that problem. Our system does this. And we simply wrote it down on index cards and put it up so that it stayed visible throughout the process. So we knew that we had captured all of the key business criteria. So benefits and drawbacks. Benefits are, everybody saw the whole picture unfold. Everybody who has been involved in the project, except for the ops people, was there in the room. From the beginning, the entire picture. We get a gut feel of size. It took an hour and a half. It was a 2-hour meeting, the first half hour, some admin and some explaining how to do this. Hour and a half, we have a gut feel of what kind of thing this project is. The sponsor was heard. The key drivers were clarified, so the sponsor had not just spoken, but he made it very clear what he needed. And there was a very strong identification with the persona. Because we were also working very closely with the users, we would use the terms interchangeably, but we would say things like, how would Collections Candy do this? What is she doing? And it shaped our future grooming. Drawbacks, it was an unfamiliar process for most of the people in the room, so it was a little bit awkward. Not everybody spoke. Some of the reason was that the domain was new to all the devs, so they didn't really, so the people who knew the type of work could get involved, but certainly the 2 juniors didn't know very much, and the 2 mid people were cautious. Also because the sponsor, the boss was in the room, people tend to be a little bit quieter, but it didn't seem to have a long-term negative effect. There was some sense of duplication. The sponsor kind of felt like he'd done all this, we've already documented the as-is, it's the spec. So in his mind, the as-is documentation was the spec. But probably the biggest problem with a story map is because we work through it sequentially, it's very easy to think that it's now a workflow. Person does this, and also work breakdown structure. So he does this and then that. So when we develop, we should do this and then we should do that. So it's easy to make that association where in fact those pieces can be completely independent. And our persona were incomplete because we didn't have customer persona. We didn't notice it until we started getting deep into the scenarios. We're like, when a person behaves like this, it would have been great to have a big picture of what kind of customer behavior, a customer who behaves like this, how would that flow through the system? It's a better and stronger scenario. Documentation, so we got out of that. Personas, key business drivers, the big picture, the whole and the parts. Really important, and it's subtle, is a lot of the information in the room is tacit knowledge. And people weren't, it's hard to put that into a document and write it down, but it's much easier to write them in stickies and put them up, and you don't feel attached, you can scrunch it up. So we captured a lot of the tacit knowledge. And we have photos, so we documented the experience. And being in the room helps you remember And looking back, it's a much clearer memory experience. And it lived on the wiki, so it's easy for people to get to. I can't say people did it a lot, but it was there. Then we created the backlog. So we took all of these stickies and we wrote them out as stories. And we did them in order to, as a I want. This is hard. And it was quite, the product owner put a lot of effort into getting this. Who's familiar with that format? In order to, as a I want. Who's familiar only with the other format, as a I want, so that? Okay. So this one places, it's hard to do, but typically when you do as a I want, so that, people forget the so that. I want a screen that does this. Why? So by looking at the why first, it helped us clarify exactly what the what is. I won't say we had it perfectly, but we had it. It was a good focus. And then on the left-hand side, we've got the features, and over here we've got the narrative. So for the most part, we had a very good understanding of what our project was going to be. Benefits. It's a complete picture in a Google document. There's just one spreadsheet with everything in it. Saved in a central location and accessed via the wiki, and we do use this daily. It is accessed via the wiki. Narrative format from the start. So benefit first. It's easy to link to features. You just put a new line in and you say this is the thing that belongs to this feature. And it's easy to add the values and then to estimate the release sizes off that. Drawbacks, it's a Google spreadsheet. So it's hard to track changes. It doesn't really do history. People will tell you it does, but it doesn't really track them. And the numbering is manual. So there were times when we had 3 items with the same number, and it didn't really matter, but in future it might. Some of the high priority or high concern issues were created as features because it's new to everybody, this process, and this is a very important thing, so it must be a feature. It turns out to be actually a story that belongs under a different feature. It wasn't a train smash, right? Acceptance criteria by the same thing. It must, at this point, display that. We need a story for that. But it turned out we could just move that to the acceptance criteria and we'd cross out the story. So, not a train smash. The other problem is that it's tempting to use the spreadsheet for grooming because we can see everything and we can just type in, right? But we lose the history when we just type into a spreadsheet. And it's also, you're not focused. Everything is all over the place. You scroll up and move sideways. So for the most part, we didn't do that. When I say for the most part, today they did. It's the very end of the group of stories that we do. So the documentation we got out of that. Release overview. All the user stories at a high level. We had features, stories, acceptance criteria, and with a narrative, we have the benefit and the value clearish. I won't, like I said, it's not perfect, but it's more focused than I've ever seen in a user, in a use case. And it lived on the wiki. And then we took all those stories and we wrote them out in cards. Because it's a smallish project, that was manageable. On a bigger project, we'd have to break it into releases, but we turned them all into cards. The product owner and myself wrote out every story. And you can see at this point, we'd actually started estimating our work, but we have a picture. So, benefits. It's a low effort to move and change these cards. Oh, that doesn't belong to that feature. Move it over there. You don't have to update and save and change the workflow or whatever. It provided a focus for grooming. We have these cards. This is what we're looking at now. And sprint planning. And it really did function as a record of a conversation. All the literature tells you that story cards should function. They function as a record of a conversation. And that's because of handwriting, would you believe? Because handwriting is harder to read than something that's printed out, computer generated. And so we spend a little bit more attention reading the handwriting. And that gives us a little bit more focus and a little bit more memory. And for that, you get a better quality of information coming in. In terms of history, when we finished the work, we crossed it out and wrote done in sprint 4. Or we had sticky notes that would say, we need to look at this part and do that. So it's very easy to keep information on it. Drawbacks, it is a bit of a pain to handle that many cards. I'm not going to lie. I'm the only person who was, I looked after that. It's not that much of a pain. It's a little bit of effort, but compared with trying to check changes in a information sync, the benefits are incredible. One of the things we didn't prefer very much to the as-is rules document, because we were working with the physical things and it's very easy to focus on them and very easy to stay focused. And the document was buried somewhere deep, and if we wanted to go and fetch it, we could go and find it. These weren't visible though. They lived in a drawer, and I would pull them out and put them up together, and people thought I was a little bit crazy. If they'd been up on the wall, probably easier to identify with. Documentation we got out of that, a visual indicator of scope. Group by feature. The card for each story had a story ID, title, size, and the grouping notes. And then after a while, I started adding in the feature when we started working outside of feature groups. And the photos lived on the wiki now, so we've got a history of what happened. All right, so that was that. Then we start ordering the backlog. And we did this very quickly before we started doing the work. So we started looking at what are our risks. We need to look at our assumptions, our dependencies, and our unknowns. But we didn't look at the whole project first. We looked at what are our biggest risks or our biggest unknown. And we worked out that the thing we most needed to prove in order to know that we could do this project was that we can see a queue with the information needed to work the account. And we went straight into sprint 1. So we've got a story map, we've got our stories all in a backlog, and we're going. And we've done some estimating, so half a sprint ahead. And these were our stories, and these are our scenario notes, and our things to make sure we look after. And we started. And part of the reason for that is a lot of the questions people couldn't answer because the tech wasn't in place yet, and we don't know how long that will take, and we don't know what the problem will be until we started doing the work. Well, then let's start doing the work. Then we went back to ordering the backlog. So the guys are working, and then we kind of went, okay, in detail, where in here are our risks? What are the assumptions that we're making? What dependencies do we have, and what are the unknowns? So for each story, or for each feature set, we needed to answer these questions. And for priority, we were asking the questions, what do we need to prove early? Because if we can't do these things, then we need to completely change the way we're going about the project. And what can we delay? What are the things that it's an unknown, but it's not that important? Where does this button go? What are the unknowns that if we don't prove will blow up the size of the project 6 months down the line? That needs to be done early. What's not that important? So we got everybody in a room, and we put down the titles of each of the features, and then started writing down what are the releases, and I'm sorry about the blurriness, but the detail doesn't matter. So what don't we know, what do we know, what are our assumptions, and everything that was relevant we just wrote down as much as we could right then. Okay? With the knowledge we had. It was more than we'd had 3 weeks before. And then I did do some manual admin. Sad to say, but it worked. And documented this in the wiki. So the risk, dependency, assumptions unknown for this section. These are the things we don't know. This one's fine. This is a large unknown. These are other small unknowns. And I would update this once we had more information. So with the date there, this is the day in which we didn't know something, and we answered this question now. See, it's done. So it was a track of the unknowns that we're reducing over time and the uncertainty. So the documentation we got out of that, from the ordering principles, we know the risks. We knew what to prove early. We knew the technical dependencies. We knew the feature dependencies. We knew which assumptions and which unknowns we needed to clarify before we could move forward. And that gave us a readiness indicator. These ones can be done, then those ones. And we had a manual tracker of changes in information on the wiki. Any questions so far? I feel like I've just been talking for like talking at, and I suspect it's something to do with the venue. In our last venue we had a fair amount of heckling, so I was expecting to have been heckled.
Did the whole team get involved in the RA thing?
Yes. Risks Radu is what I call it. I don't think it has a name. So the whole team sat around the big table that we've got. We put it up on the big whiteboard and moved those questions around. Well, firstly, they did the documentation there. They wrote up the questions. And then when we came to estimating, they were all there.
When was this all happening? How much did you do upfront before you started the project, and how much was happening during the sprints?
So that part where we did the story mapping and turning it into the backlog grooming, we did before we started the project. And the first thing was and that was on the 9th of May. We started the project on the 15th of May. So the following week, the sprint 1, I think it was sprint 15th, stand to be corrected, but it was pretty much the following week, we start building. And then we started getting into the depth of release plan, of the Radu. So we knew more or less what the project was. It wasn't a scary unknown. We knew what our unknowns were in terms of architecture. We knew more or less where we were going, but we didn't have detail, too much detail. Okay, so release planning, we were all in the same room again, looking at the same set of whiteboards, and here are our cards, and we've given it a guess. Those numbers were guesses, and the guesses were matched up to our Radu, right? So we know what we don't know, and we know what we know, and so we could say, this we are pretty sure about, these were unclear. One of the things we did was when there were two possible ways of doing something and we had to make an assumption, we'd estimate story points consistently, but we'd estimate and note the assumptions made about this, and note that if this is incorrect, we would need to revisit. And sometimes we'd estimate on two different paths, so we knew up front, if they pick that, we do this, if they pick that, we do that. But we were very clear up front about how confident we were about that estimate. And then the ordering was based on those principles. We'd say, okay, well, assigning list was low risk and low effort, so we didn't need to stress about it too much. We knew more or less how we were going to do it. Our biggest risk was to do month-end changes. Then we needed to prove that the lists display accurately. Then we needed to prove that the actions on the account are correct, and then we needed to assign lists. Yep. So we took all those numbers that we'd estimated and we pumped it into our release our spreadsheet, and with the features on the one side we could say those are the total story points. By this stage we are 2 sprints in. So we started, when we first did it was 91, so something had been added, something been taken away, I don't know. And those two we can see are mostly finished. And yeah, with 2 sprints in we had a known velocity point, so we could say at 92 it's probably more than 10 sprints, because we knew that there were stories that hadn't been estimated yet. So we don't know how much more than 10 sprints, but it's probably something more than that. And to completion is just simple math. But we had this information now. It's as accurate as you can get. And then 2 sprints later, we had now the 95 points, and we started to then have release, how many per release are coming. So at this point we've got an ordered, prioritized backlog. We've got a best guess estimate of the feature sizes. And we've got the best guess release size. It's as accurate as I've ever seen, which is not to say it was 100% accurate, right? And then after 2 sprints, we had a team velocity data point that we could work with, and we had, from that, an approximate release duration. And the customer had already seen working software by now. All right, so grooming, we have mock-ups. Our product owner was pretty awesome with these. She uses balsamic, and she we go in and draw up. Because we were replacing an as-is system, there were a fair amount that was known about it. So she could start with some mock-ups beforehand, and then have some notes and how we're going to do this, which gave us a great starting point for technical conversations. People didn't come into the room going, I don't know what to say. You don't know what you want. So a little bit, the people could get right into the, but where would we save that data? Most of these were created after the Radu discussion, so everybody knew what the features were about already by the time we looked at the mocks. So we could ask questions that were directed instead of like, oh, is that what you want me to build? The questions were more, oh, but I thought we were going to do that, and shouldn't we try it like this? It was also very easy for users to relate to in grooming. Once we kind of got our release grooming going, we started including the users in our grooming sessions, and that was incredibly valuable because we started getting some, oh, but aren't we going to have this part? And you're like, the what part? And they're like, the thing that does that. Thank you. Let's incorporate that. It's before we've even started building. It gives an indication of system flow. These are flat markups. They're not prototypes, not click-through. And the acceptance criteria are included by default. Not all of them, but a significant amount. You can see that this needs to be in that format. And it's a low cost to change. Drawbacks, trying to get it right before we started. So the thing with mocks, particularly that level of high fidelity mock, is that it's easy to kind of say, this is the thing. So we have to get it right before we take it to the team. So it was a bit of a process, but not a long-term problem. It can anchor ideas too soon. So if for the stuff that is brand new functionality, you don't want to mock too early. Of course, we've done most of this after the Radu conversation, so there was a good understanding. But you've got to have mocks at the right time. The team is less inclined to model visually when you've got a picture in front of you. So when there's no picture, the people are more likely to get up to the whiteboard and go, oh, but shouldn't it do that? But there are times when mock would present questions and we'd get into that as well. And this is just an admin thing. They were creating PDFs and they were saved into the wiki, but they weren't easily linked to the stories, so we had to go and find them and search for them. Again, not a train smash. So we've got page layout and navigation, we've got our acceptance criteria, rules and comments, and we've got the current information. It was frequently outdated, so we always knew, sometimes the mocks would be like a week or 2 weeks out of date. That's as far behind as they got. Any questions about that so far?
Yeah.
Yes.
Don't you think that's that conversation with mocks and that thing is happening way too early in that thing? Because you abstracted yourself from the problem now that's described in the story, and you're talking about the solution in grooming when the emergent property of the system, which should happen at design level, is confined by what the user interface now has to look like. Even though it's a system that's in real world and being used, what you've done is you've basically said that this system will look like this, and your architecture of your system will have to follow what the UI is saying.
So are you talking about that? Can anchor ideas too soon?
Yeah, even more than that. I mean, just the presentation of actually understanding the problem before you present the solution. For me, it's a difference between iterating and incrementing your product.
Can we take that one later?
Yes.
Did you try paper prototyping at all?
No. That's nice, actually.
I think it might address some of those problems.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So then we've got an idea of what we're going to build. And also we're half a sprint behind. Sometimes the mocks were done better or more in advance, but the detail that we looked at was a half a sprint behind. So we take our scenario stories and we take each of the stories, and they were done per sprint. They're saved like that in our wiki, and work through scenarios. How many of you are doing BDD? Do you know what it is? How many of you know what it is? Okay. So the idea behind it is that you take a story and you say, what are the potential paths in this story? Well, if a user has this, or a customer has an account like this, when this part of the system behaves, does its transaction, these steps should follow. And from my perspective, it's the answer to the detailed use cases of the preconditions, postconditions. The format is given a certain set of conditions. When a single event happens in the system, then these are the outputs or the outcomes of that event. It's really into how will this thing behave in each scenario. Now, you're never going to get all of them, but by talking about them before we've written a line of code, we've got a far clearer picture of, oh, but what about if that happens? The quality of that conversation goes up the more users are involved, the more people who are familiar with what the system is going to do, kind of say, oh, but sometimes it happens like this. So I don't think we got quite as close as we could have, but what we have there is pretty much test cases in advance. Benefits of BDD. It gives us a very detailed discussion of system flow. We talk about this quite in depth, because there's pre and post conditions of the use cases, but in a simpler format. It's not like, we don't have to know that you're going to press this button. We know about how the data is going to act. It gives us test data. So to know the account number is this, and the age is that, and the behavior is this, it can be automated. And because we started talking at this level, we started modeling more visually. So people would kind of go, oh, but shouldn't it go like that? Well, if it does that, we need to change it like so. From which we would, the product owner would go away and update the mock-ups, which was great, and then bring them back again. Drawbacks, they are hard to do initially. So is TDD, so is, it's a mind change. But the flip side of them hard to do properly is it's actually very easy to get them wrong. And I had one product owner on a different project who used to write, given the story title, when, anytime, then this thing must happen. It's a deceptively simple format. But the more you start to work with it and the more you understand it, for me the breakthrough was thinking of it as test cases. Then you kind of get in a different level to the rewrite my story in a different format. That's all there is.
Can I make an observation, Cara?
Yes.
It's not actually the given when then that's important. It's actually the title of the scenario which conveys more meaning than the given when then.
Okay.
If
I
you word that title properly, those given when thens at grooming or wherever will be filled up by the team. Because
Yes.
they'll ask questions about if you are very verbose with your rich language, then you don't actually need that. But fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Nice. So when you do it, you kind of first you get documented tests, but we explore what is the expected paths, what are the alternative paths, and what are the failed conditions. And the title for each of these scenarios is what Wayne's referring to. When the situation when this happens, well, the system would be behaving like this, and or the system would be in this state when that happened, and that would. But the title gives you that clarity. What it all gave us was better stories, because we understood the story more, because we talked about it in more specific detail. We got test data for automation, and the guys did automate the acceptance tests. And our backlogs on mockups, and the Radu page was updated. So fresh information. We had a sprint review. I'm sorry to say I don't have a picture of the sprint review, but we would all go into the boardroom and put it up, and there were some hairier moments than others. But we would have the same group of people who were involved in our story mapping session. Pretty much all of them were back to see what the working documentation.
Take your failure about all that, Cara.
was then. And they would then say, oh, okay, now that I've seen that, but the column is wrong. The format that you're using, the date format is wrong. So we've done 2 weeks worth of work, and we've got really good, high quality feedback immediately on what is this thing. Oh, well, that doesn't, it doesn't normally work like that, or how about we do it like this? So we got lots of, a lot of them were just tiny little changes that we could make immediately. Some of them were bigger, and this is how we documented them. It may not be the most perfect way, but it was fit for purpose, and that was really what we're looking for.
So can I
Yes?
ask a question? In your review sessions when that happened, did the team feel like, basically the sprint was a miss or stuff wasn't clear? Did they react negatively to it, or did they take it as, well, people are seeing it now and we are actually now building onto it?
It was definitely the latter. But the quality of feedback we got was very high. So people would look at it and they were very pleased with what they saw. They'd been involved from the start, so it wasn't a surprise when they saw it for the first time. And I think that for me is the biggest win, that they knew from the start what they were going to be seeing and they saw what they expected to see. We'd obviously make changes that wasn't identical, but they were involved. And the team, I think they really appreciated it.
Because what I found is, we also had wonderful feedback in our review sessions, but whenever it happened that, it was something like a column or a font or something silly, or the team actually felt a bit negative towards it, and it was a bit difficult to manage, because for me it was quite a part of the natural process of just...
I think for this team, they'd worked without customer feedback for so long, it was a wonderful and lovely thing. It's like, okay, thank you.
I
We
have
can
some
work
thoughts
with that.
for you afterwards.
Wouldn't sending the EDD test cases
Through to them.
starting it to them, and having them sort of sign off but agree that that's what expected?
We included them in some of our user grooming, but for most of them it was too technical. So we would talk, when we'd drawn up some, they kind of went, okay, yes, but they are not thinking about, so we should have got them involved in a better way. It would have gone nicer, but I think with the information they were able to give us, it was, in my opinion, the highest quality we could get. But we did show them and they were like, oh, this is lovely. Cool, nice, good to know. So benefits and drawbacks. Benefits, the sponsors and the users were clear on our progress as we went along. We had immediate feedback on the work, and we could incorporate the small changes in the next sprint, and we could schedule longer changes for grooming and discuss priority with them as well. So you want that, that's cool, does it fit, where does it go? And it generated excitement. We had one user, the main user, the Super Sue, at probably about 3 releases in, sat there with wide eyes and said afterwards, it's alive. It's like, awesome. And that for me was the most valuable user feedback I've ever seen. Drawbacks, we had a long first release cycle, there were 7 sprints, so it's about 3.5 months. And the users lost touch with the early features, but we felt that they'd seen them. So by the time they went into UAT, they were a little bit lost. But we structured the UAT around that, but there was a disconnect from the early to the late. I don't know if there are other drawbacks to weeklies, to the sprint review. I personally didn't see any. So, we're almost done. This is just a picture of how it all worked. So, bringing all of those concepts together. For our create list story, we've got a story, we've got a mock, so we start talking about it, we build our scenarios together, and we build working software, which we would then demo at the end of the sprint. Action accounts, we've got the story, we've got our mock, and they started changing a little bit in shape at the time. We've got our scenarios, and our working software. So the assign list one, a little bit more detail, we do our grooming, got the story. That was new, completely new functionality, and it was, remember, it was delayed towards the end. So we finally got some low fidelity mockups. What are low fidelity mockups?
Pictures on the whiteboard.
They're drawings. It's, and so I think when you're talking about paper prototyping is similar, except people are doing it the same way the sticky works, you get to plan it first and then you put your ideas together.
No,
So
it's just doing that on a piece of paper, not on a whiteboard.
oh, okay. I was
Drawing
thinking
your
something else.
line markups on a piece of paper.
Okay. And so the whole team was now involved in what is this thing, and maybe we should have a column that does this. And it was a very interactive, and the later we got into the project and the more we were building new things, the more we did have these low fidelity markups. Then we have sprint planning, by which time our lovely product owner has drawn a markup, and we start going with in the scenarios, assign, reassign, how does that work? And then we have our sprint review. So here's our working software. Oh, now that we've seen it, please can we have this? And can you change it like that? We want to see these accounts and do these things. So by the time it went into production, we'd updated to have the number of accounts worked and the assigned to and whatever. And we had, from that, incredibly high value adoption, very good adoption of the system. So what we got with just-in-time requirements, or the process more or less summarized, we started with high-level scope. It's the big picture, but it's not the detail. We went then into the RADU, the risks, assumptions, dependencies, and unknowns, which gave us a readiness factor. We worked at sprint, so then we at the sprint ready detail, sprint and a half ahead. And what happened that I noticed most out of the projects I've worked on is we very seldom heard this. How many of you guys hear this a lot when you start developing? Oh, that's what it's not going to work like that anymore. We have to change it like this. It was already changed by the time we got to develop it. And it was new and fresh in our minds. Which gave us an incredibly high quality of working software for the user, their experience, their flow through the system, and their expectation. We did have performance problems. So one of these things that the Agile requirements side of things didn't take care of was how this thing is going to behave when it goes into production. So we probably need to find a way to incorporate that earlier. So it wasn't a perfect implementation. But from a user satisfaction level, it was incredibly high. So our learnings. Our story mapping and scenarios complete the picture. User stories on their own are not enough. Story mapping on its own is not enough. I did have one person, quite a senior analyst, come to me and say, that's story mapping. Couldn't we do that as swim lanes? And I'm like, swim lanes are different and they're small, and the collaborative nature of building, because we were talking about doing it in a narrative process. Story mapping is not a narrative, it's a process in which we all get to understand the problem to the best we can right at the beginning where there are many unknowns. Scenarios are the other end of the user story, where there's not enough in a user story. I can see that I need to do this, but the implementation I can't get my head around because the process doesn't make sense to me. No single tool does all the things, but this particular combination of living tools is living documentation, or as close as we've got so far. And I originally had that as close as we'll ever get, but of course that's because I can't imagine. It's hard to imagine doing things differently, and there will of course be other ways of doing things differently. And I suspect in a lean startup, we've got a lot faster cycling of that. So that's as far as I and the team I was working with have got so far. For our next project, we will have domain knowledge and known velocity, which is a bonus, although our team has changed, but we have a known set of or perspective. I'd like to be starting with impact mapping, so we start with clearer goals and clearer personas. Who's familiar with impact mapping? Let's see. Okay, Gojko Adzik. He's a guy who has done a lot of work around specification by example, which is the same as BDD and acceptance testing. And he's put it together. Impact mapping is a collection of good practices that work very well to get good quality work out. And it starts with making sure your goal is clear so that we know we're going to move through the system going to be meeting the right requirements. I'd like to use a backlog management tool. They're not lovely. I don't think there is a lovely one anywhere, but
Excel.
But a Google spreadsheet, which is about as close as you can get to Excel, it's fine for small projects. Once you get big, linking those features and the fact that you can't put scenarios and mock-ups and stories all together, so you have to go find them in threads, it would be nice to have those all together. And we need to find a way to integrate the as-is documentation better and spend more time on scenarios and bring in the architecture and use the performance stuff earlier.
Can I ask a question on that as
Yeah.
is documentation? Did you have access to the previous system?
Yes.
So I would prefer to use the system as the as-is documentation rather than the document written upon.
So there was quite a lot. That was the way in which the flow was. Should go in and go, okay, voice actors like that. And we've got access to the code so we could see it. But working with the old system and understanding those business rules well, I don't know. But yes, the whole team, well, not the whole team, but members of the team would get involved and go
I was
through
just
the old
wondering if you
system.
could play with the app in grooming.
Yeah, no, between grooming. So, recommended reading. So when I said the research that I've done, this is mostly where it comes from. So impact mapping I've just told you about. Lean designers, there's some nice stuff there. Lean designers and agile reflections, there's some nice stuff in both of those. Jeff Patton is the story mapping person. There are lots of blogs around it, but that's a good place to start. BDD, Dan North and Liz Keogh. So Dan North introduced the concept, Liz kind of picked it up and started running with it. And she has a slide deck that is a thing of beauty. It is the thing that ties, and she ties from company vision down to code level, how you tie this all together from we write code, company has a vision, and we do people need capabilities, vision, goal, capabilities. She goes all the way down to the code that we write, and then she maps it all back up again. And I tell you, when I saw that, I think I sat with a smile for it. So, far more useful to you than this particular course. Go and find Liz Keogh's slide deck. All right, so that's it. Questions? Yes.
So, I don't know what the lifetime of a system is likely to be, but imagine a year or 2 years down the road. What's your sense of how this living documentation is going to help with maintainability of the system? How do you picture the team using it long term to figure out why it works the way it works, or we need to fix this bug, but what are the likely impacts going to be? That kind of conversation.
I haven't thought about that in detail. With the scenarios available, you can go back and look at why did we build it like this. We were assuming that it would do this, we were assuming that it would do that. We were assuming that these were the outcomes we were hoping to achieve. To be honest, whenever I've seen people fix a bug, I have not seen them go back to old documentation. They go into the code and they say, I don't know. And often the people maintaining it and the people who built it are different. So I guess I haven't seen people go looking for, and particularly documents. So that section at the beginning where I was a project manager and a project administrator, those documents did not get used. In the second, when I was a project manager, we did actually work with the documents in the grooming sessions, the analysis sessions, and then they would kind of die and they lived in a vault. So it's an easier, what is nice about the wiki is that everybody, there's a lot of other system documentation there and people do go in there and look for information. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Who actually maintained all of that documentation? Because you had a load of developers there. So during the course of your project, who actually did all of the documentation? Who wrote all the scenarios? Because you had one product owner and you've got all these developers.
We wrote scenarios in grooming.
But who physically maintained, supported and managed all all these documents that you're talking about? Who took ownership of them?
So the product owner around the scenarios and the mocks, so product owner, as the owner, would make sure, because also then we've got the filtering, is this the right thing or isn't the right thing? But we already had those answers by the time we came into grooming. Or we'd ask those questions, well that doesn't make sense, we'd scrap that story. But so between the product owner and I did a little bit, so that Radu thing, I would go back and update and pick up, the other thing we did was pictures of the release planning. Okay, this has changed and now that's out, so we've got a document of the interactions that we had and the decisions that we made. Very little of the devs. Why do you ask?
Well, it's just typically in a lot of project environments you have these business analysts or those kind of roles, and it seems to me that your product owner was that kind of role. They were really quite well groomed, whereas in my experience product owners aren't those kind of people. Product owners are people that sit in business and are kind of decision makers, as opposed to the people that really get involved in doing mock-ups. And
so on this project, yes, but on previous projects, no. So the product owner who's more a project manager is the kind of person who goes given, when, anytime, then, something.
Yeah.
But as they work with the system and they start to understand that they can provide comfortably a title that says this, and then the interaction with the whole team is what creates the document. Somebody will write it down, somebody will type it up, but it's as a result of a collaboration. And the more people work with it, the closer they get to, the more comfortable, the more flows.
Yeah, I think it interests us the other day's question, which is, do you need someone to kind of own it still? Because after that ownership disappears and the team disbands and it goes into that business as usual world, the document, no one owns it anymore. It's, the team who took ownership of it.
So what I'm finding interesting is both of you talk about the document. It isn't a document. It's a wiki, which is a form of documentation where things are closely related to each other, and it stays. So it doesn't need to be filed. It
still needs to be owned and managed.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
So I've worked in both environments where we had, the document, speaking to your earlier experience, and I've worked in environments where we used a wiki to have a very dynamic and living document that sort of lived beyond the lifetime of that project or that team, which kind of gives you that team memory that lives on beyond the team itself. And the reason for my question was I was curious as to how you saw these different document elements kind of living together as a whole thing, as opposed to I need to search in the wiki and I might find a photo or I might find a post-it.
Which is why I would like to be using a backlog management tool where you can put the pieces together. Apparently I need to shut up now.
Disagree. I think all of this documentation is about building the software. Once the software exists, that is your documentation. Your set of tests checked into version control and your working software that's very well commented and documented. That's your documentation.
I've just been informed the food is outside, it's getting cold.
Wow, how to kill a
We
conversation.
continue this conversation outside. Just some notes. Thanks, Cara. That was awesome. If you want to hear more awesome talks, you have a Scrum gathering, which, if you hadn't heard, is 5 tracks of glorious informational presentations and workshops on product management, tech traps, goodness, Scrum mastering, management.
Magic.
And there are tickets available.
And it's on the 22nd and 23rd of October.
22nd, 23rd of
Just
October.
less than 3 weeks.
Kelvin Grove in Cape Town. And there is no November event because the committee, after organising the Scrum gathering, will be having a sleep. But we'll be back in December.
Yeah, I was wondering.
I will put it on, we can get it onto the SATSA website. We'll do, I'm going to just put it into PDF format.
And there is a
Along
video.
with the video.
There is a video.
Oh, and there is a video. Things one forgets.
Okay, so thank you, Cara. DBT and Alan Bray. Yep, that's us. So enjoy the